The wind howled like a wild animal across the empty plains, carrying with it a bitter cold that could freeze the breath in a person's chest. It was the winter of 1874 on the American frontier, a place where life was hard and every day was a struggle to survive. Snow had been falling for days, covering everything in a thick white blanket. The trees stood bare, their branches stiff with ice. The small wooden houses in the settlement looked like they might collapse under the weight of the storm. On the far edge of town stood a lonely cabin. It was made of rough logs, built by the hands of people who had learned not to expect comfort. Inside, a group of settlers huddled together, their faces pale from the cold. The fire in the stone hearth burned low, throwing out a weak orange glow. Each piece of wood they added to the fire was precious, and they all knew there was not enough to last the night. Among the group stood Margaret Doyle, known to everyone simply as Maggie. She was a woman with a strong face, sharp brown eyes, and hair the color of chestnuts. Life on the frontier had made her tough. She had come to this town 2 years earlier, and ever since, people had kept their distance from her. Some said she was too bold for a woman. Others whispered about her past as a singer in a noisy saloon far away. Whatever the reason, Maggie had learned to live on her own. She spoke little, worked hard, and didn't beg for anyone's approval. Tonight, however, things were different. The storm outside was like nothing the town had seen before. The temperature had dropped so low that the wooden walls of the cabin groaned. Maggie, like everyone else, had nowhere else to go. The wind outside could freeze a person in minutes, and even the strongest could not survive alone. Around the fire, there were 6 others. Old Mr. Harris sat in a rocking chair, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, his gray beard trembling as he breathed. The Miller couple sat side by side on a bench, their hands clasped tightly together. Their young boy, Thomas, only 10 years old, lay on the floor with his back to the warm stones, shivering under a thin blanket. 2 young men, Caleb and John, stood near the door, trying to block the draft with a heavy piece of cloth. They stomped their boots to keep feeling in their toes. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke, wet wool, and the cold itself. Maggie paced slowly near the hearth. She could feel the cold creeping in, even though the fire was still burning. She had seen nights like this before, and she knew what could happen if the fire went out. People didn't just fall asleep. They didn't wake up again. She glanced at the small pile of firewood stacked against the wall. It would be gone long before morning. She spoke in a low but clear voice. "We don't have enough wood." Caleb turned toward her. "We'll make it through," he said quickly, as if saying it would make it true. Maggie shook her head. "No, we won't. Look at the wood. Look at the fire. This storm isn't stopping tonight." Silence filled the room. No one wanted to admit she was right, but they all saw the truth. The wind whistled through the small cracks in the walls, making the flames flicker. Thomas curled tighter under his blanket. Mr. Harris coughed softly. "We've survived storms before." "Not like this one," Maggie replied. Her voice was firm, not loud, but it carried weight. She had a way of speaking that made people listen even when they didn't want to. Mrs. Miller reached out and adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. "What do we do then?" she asked quietly. Maggie looked around the cabin. There was only one bed pushed up against the far wall. It was a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress and a patchwork quilt. Normally, only 1 or 2 people used it, but tonight it was their only real chance to stay warm. "We need to stay together," Maggie said. "Close. We share what we have or we don't make it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone knew what she meant, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The settlers of this frontier town were proud people. They were used to working hard and keeping their distance. They respected personal space. Maggie, being who she was, the outcast, the woman others whispered about, made her suggestion feel even more uncomfortable for some. John cleared his throat. "You mean all of us?" He gestured toward the bed, his eyebrows raised. "Yes," Maggie said simply. "All of us." For a moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked, sending up a small spark. Outside, the wind slammed against the wall, making the shutters rattle. Caleb let out a short, uncertain laugh. "That's not how things are done." Maggie turned to him slowly. "Caleb," she said, her voice calm but sharp, "how long do you think you'll last when that fire burns out?" He didn't answer. Thomas sat up, his little face pale but serious. "I'm cold," he whispered. Mrs. Miller pulled him close, rubbing his arms. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said softly, though she didn't sound sure. Maggie took a step closer to the group. Her boots made a soft sound on the wooden floor. "Listen to me," she said. "The night doesn't care what we think. The cold doesn't care what we believe. It will take anyone who's not strong enough. And no one in this room is strong enough alone." They all looked at her. For the first time that evening, Maggie didn't look like the woman they avoided in town. She looked like someone who had seen things they hadn't, someone who knew how to survive. "We share the bed," she said. "We share the quilts. We stay close. That's how we make it to morning." Mrs. Miller nodded first quietly. She had a child to protect, and her heart told her Maggie was right. Mr. Harris followed, muttering something about old bones not liking the cold. The two young men still looked uneasy, but they didn't argue. Caleb spoke at last. "It's not proper." Maggie met his eyes. "Proper doesn't matter when you're frozen." The wind howled again, louder this time, as if to prove her point. Snow hit the windows, and a thin line of cold air crept in through the cracks. They started to prepare. Mrs. Miller gathered the quilts from the bed. Maggie checked the walls for leaks, stuffing cloth into the gaps where the cold air came in. Caleb and John dragged their coats and blankets closer. Mr. Harris slowly stood up from his chair, his joints stiff from age. Maggie gave quiet instructions, not bossy, but firm. She told them to layer the quilts, to place Thomas in the middle where he'd be warmest, and to keep their boots near the bed so they could find them in the morning. Even Caleb, who had argued with her, followed her lead. It wasn't pride anymore. It was survival. As they worked, the cabin grew quieter. The only sounds were the soft rustle of fabric, the crackling of the fire, and the storm outside. Maggie moved with calm, sure steps. She had been alone for so long, but tonight she carried herself like someone responsible for everyone in that room. When everything was ready, they gathered around the bed. The straw mattress creaked under their weight as they lay down one by one. Thomas curled up against his mother. Mr. Harris lay on one side, wrapped in his old wool blanket. Caleb and John, awkward at first, finally settled in. Their faces stiff with discomfort, but their bodies slowly relaxing as warmth began to build between them. Maggie lay on the other edge of the bed, her back against the cold wall. She could feel the warmth of the others slowly spreading, making the air a little less sharp. Her chest rose and fell steadily as she listened to the storm outside. She had lived through nights like this before, but never with people who had once looked at her like she didn't belong. Now, in the face of the storm, none of that mattered. Out here on the wild frontier, survival didn't care about old whispers or pride. It only cared about what people did when the night came for them. She stared at the faint light of the fire. It was still burning, but small now, just a glowing bed of red coals. If they had chosen to sleep apart, it wouldn't have lasted the night. They would have woken to ice and silence. But here, together, they had a fighting chance. Thomas let out a small sigh, already half asleep. Mrs. Miller held his hand. Mr. Harris muttered something about spring and warm sunshine. Caleb shifted uncomfortably but didn't move away. John's breathing slowed as he drifted off. Maggie remained awake for a long time, listening to the storm. Her mind wandered back to the many nights she had spent alone, when the wind had howled just like this and she had thought she might not see the morning. She had learned long ago that surviving wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about being brave enough to do what others wouldn't. She closed her eyes slowly, the warmth from the shared bed wrapping around her like a shield. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the wind kept howling. But inside that small cabin, a group of outcasts, families, and strangers had found a way to stand together against the cold. And Maggie Doyle, once the woman people whispered about, had become the voice everyone listened to. The night stretched on like a long, endless road. Outside the cabin, the wind kept howling, pushing snow against the walls with a steady, icy force. Inside, it was quiet except for the soft breathing of the people lying close together on the single bed. Their body heat had slowly filled the space between them, creating a small pocket of warmth in a world that had turned frozen. Maggie Doyle lay on the far edge, her back pressed against the cold wall. Every now and then she could feel a thin line of chill seeping through the wood, but compared to the bitter air outside, it was nothing. She listened carefully, to the storm, to the faint crackle of the fire, and to the breathing of the people beside her. The storm was still strong. The wind had not slowed. The night wasn't going to end easily. Thomas, the Miller boy, had fallen into a deep sleep. His little hands were tucked under the quilts, and his mother's arm was wrapped tightly around him. Mr. Harris snored softly, the sound almost comforting in the stillness. Caleb and John had stopped shifting around. Now their breathing was slow and steady. The air around the bed felt warm, almost cozy, despite the storm outside. Maggie had stayed awake longer than the rest, keeping an eye on the glowing embers in the hearth. She knew if the fire went out completely, the cold would creep back in fast. Every hour or so, she quietly rose from the bed, added one small piece of wood, then returned to her place. It wasn't much, but it kept the faint red glow alive. As the hours passed, something changed in the cabin. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling. Earlier that night, when Maggie had spoken up, there had been hesitation, awkwardness, and doubt. But now, with everyone close together, breathing the same warm air, it felt as if the walls of pride and distance had slowly melted like frost under the sun. At one point, Mrs. Miller whispered softly in the dark, "Maggie, thank you." Maggie didn't turn to look at her. She just gave a small nod in the dark. "It's nothing," she said quietly. "It's what needed to be done." Mrs. Miller gave a small, tired smile and held her son closer. She had been scared earlier, but now, lying there, she felt something she hadn't felt all day: hope. The storm outside roared and raged, but inside, the tiny cabin became a world of its own. The warmth grew stronger the longer they stayed close. It wasn't the kind of heat a roaring fire could make. It was the warmth that came from people coming together when they had no other choice. Hours passed. The moon rose high, though no one could see it through the thick snow. The storm reached its loudest point in the middle of the night, making the shutters rattle and the roof creak. Snow piled higher and higher against the door. If anyone had tried to leave, they would have been swallowed by the white silence outside. But no one moved. No one even thought about leaving. Sometime after midnight, Caleb stirred slightly. His arm brushed against Maggie's, and for a brief second their eyes met in the dim orange glow from the fire. Earlier that evening, he had looked at her with uncertainty, with the same silent judgment that many in town had held for so long. But now his expression was different. It held quiet respect, something he had never shown her before. "You were right," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear. Maggie didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just nodded once. "I've seen nights like this," she whispered back. "And I've seen what happens when people try to face them alone." Caleb said nothing more, but something in his face had changed. The walls between them weren't gone, but they had cracks now. The storm had done what nothing else in the town could, forced them to stand on the same side. Near dawn, Maggie finally allowed her eyes to close. She drifted in and out of light sleep, never fully letting her guard down. The storm still howled, but in her half-dreaming state, she could feel the warmth of the people around her. It reminded her of the nights from her childhood, long before she became the woman people whispered about. Back then, winters had been cruel too, but she had learned that sharing warmth saved lives. When the first light of morning finally pushed through the cracks in the shutters, the wind had calmed. It was still cold, colder than most people could stand, but the worst of the storm had passed. A pale gray light filled the cabin. Maggie was the first to open her eyes. She sat up slowly, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Her breath came out in little white clouds. The fire had burned down to a pile of soft gray ash, but the cabin was still warm from the shared heat. She looked around. Thomas was still sleeping soundly, his cheeks a healthy pink. Mrs. Miller's hair was messy, but her face was peaceful. Mr. Harris had stopped snoring and was blinking sleepily at the light. Caleb and John stirred slowly, blinking away sleep. No one looked frozen. No one was gone. Maggie stood up and walked toward the door. The wood was stiff with cold. She pressed her hand against it and could feel the snow packed high on the other side. When she pushed gently, the door didn't move. "Snow's piled up," she said. John jumped from the bed, rubbing his arms to shake off the cold. "I'll help you clear it." The others began to rise too, pulling on boots, coats, and scarves. They moved more slowly than usual, stiff from the night, but there was a quiet energy in the room now, a shared relief. Caleb picked up a small iron poker and used it to push the door from the inside. The packed snow cracked and broke away, letting in a rush of freezing air. Maggie and John worked together, clearing the rest with their boots and hands. When they finally managed to open the door fully, bright white sunlight reflected off the endless snow outside. It was a breathtaking sight. The whole world was covered in glittering white like a blanket of shining glass. The town was silent. No horses, no wagons, no voices, just snow and the pale winter sun. Maggie stepped outside carefully, her boots sinking deep into the snow. It reached almost to her knees. The wind had stopped, but the air was still freezing. She turned back to the cabin and saw the others standing in the doorway. Thomas peeked out from behind his mother, his eyes wide at the sight of the snow piled higher than he was tall. "We made it," Caleb said quietly, almost to himself. Maggie looked at him, her brown eyes calm and steady. "Yes," she said. "We did." There was something different in his tone. He wasn't just talking about surviving the storm. He was talking about how they survived, together. The Millers began to prepare breakfast with the small bit of food they had left. Mr. Harris sat near the doorway, the sunlight falling across his weathered face. Caleb and John worked to clear a small path from the cabin to the road. Maggie, standing just outside the door, breathed in the sharp morning air. It stung her lungs, but it also felt fresh, alive. She thought back to the night before. If they had chosen pride over sense, this morning would have been silent. But now there was laughter. There was movement. There was life. As the morning went on, neighbors from nearby cabins appeared, bundled in heavy coats, shoveling paths through the snow. Some were surprised to see everyone from Maggie's cabin alive and well. They had all known how cold it had been last night. A few offered curious glances toward Maggie, the woman they used to avoid. Caleb spoke to one of them. "She's the reason we're still breathing," he said simply, nodding toward Maggie. His voice was steady, without hesitation. It wasn't a grand speech, but it was more powerful than anything she'd heard from him before. The neighbors' eyebrows lifted. They nodded slowly, a new kind of respect in their eyes. Maggie didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She wasn't looking for praise. She only wanted to make it through the winter like everyone else. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was standing outside the town circle. By midday, the cabin was filled with warm smells from a pot of stew. Thomas sat near the hearth, carving shapes into a piece of wood with his small knife, his cheeks rosy. Mrs. Miller hummed a quiet tune as she stirred the pot. Mr. Harris told stories about storms from years ago. Caleb and John sat near the window talking to her, really talking, not just giving polite nods like they used to. Maggie leaned against the doorframe, watching the snow sparkle under the pale sun. She had spent years walking through this town with whispers behind her back, feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. But now, because of one cold night and one brave decision, something had shifted. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The frontier was full of uncertainty, storms, hunger, loneliness. But as she looked at the people inside the cabin, laughing and talking like old friends, she felt something warm deep inside her chest. It wasn't the fire. It wasn't the quilts. It was something far stronger. For the first time in years, Maggie Doyle wasn't just the outcast woman people whispered about. She was part of something. She had led them through the cold, not with a weapon or a speech, but with the simple, powerful will to survive together. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, she closed the door softly, keeping the warmth inside. The storm had taken the night, but they had taken it back with courage and unity. And in a place where winters were long and cruel, that made all the difference.